Join me inside my writing yurt. Come on. Our next question comes from Rosie C., writing from the UK. So I imagine it's a bit later in the day for you, Rosie. But Rosie asked a wonderful question. I actually had a lot of fun thinking about your question, Rosie. So here's how I'll describe the question so everybody can hear. In lesson 9 of the Basic Cozy Grammar course, we discussed the topic of singular versus plural verbs. And here are two exercises, or two questions from the interactive exercises. In each case, the student is being asked to decide between two forms of the verb, the singular form or the plural form. So here's the first question. Rain and sleet cling or clings to the branches. So again, the question is rain and sleet cling or clings to the branches. And in this case, the correct answer is rain and sleet cling to the branches. So that's one example. The other example is this. Every day, Bill or Jim knock or knocks on my door. Again, every day, Bill or Jim knock or knocks on my door. And in this case, the correct answer is knock. So every day, Bill or Jim knocks on my door. Now, the question is, what makes clings singular and cling plural, and what makes knocks singular and knock plural? Because we usually think of adding an S to words to make them plural. So there's something that can be a little bit confusing here. So let me walk through what I think might make the situation clearer for you, Rosie. And then I'll invite you to jump in and let me know if this is clarifying things. So let's give a little overview. When we're talking about singular or plural verbs, another way of talking about that is agreement between the subject and the predicate, or even more simply, the subject and the verb of a sentence. So anytime we have a subject which is plural, meaning there's more than one subject, we use a verb that matches or corresponds with, or indeed agrees with that subject. So in the first example, rain and sleet, we have two things. So we use a plural form of the verb, which happens to be cling. Rain and sleet cling to the branches. Now, in the other example, there's something a little tricky, because the other example has every day, Bill or Jim. And somebody might say, well, if there's Bill and then there's Jim, there's two people, so we should use a plural verb. Well, that would be a very logical seeming thing to think. But in this case, the key is the word or. Every day, Bill or Jim. So Bill does it, but Jim doesn't. Or Jim does it, but Bill doesn't. In either case, there's only one person. Every day, Bill or Jim knocks on my door. So we use the singular form of the verb knocks. So that's the general overview about the agreement of verbs with singular and plural subjects. Now here's where things may get a little more confusing, is that when we're talking about nouns, we usually think of nouns adding an S to make them plural. So one flower, we have many flowers. One flower has no S. Flowers with an S is the plural form. And so we may think this is starting to get confusing, because in some cases we add an S, in some cases we don't add an S. What's going on here? Fair enough. And to make things even more interesting, in our examples, knock can be both a verb or a noun? I heard a knock on the door. Here, knock is a noun. He knocks on the door. Knock here is a verb. Same thing with cling. I mean, you have these fabric, whatever you call those, fabric sheet manufacturers talking about the terrible evil of static cling. Here, cling is a noun, and of course, we don't necessarily talk about, oh, I have so many static clings in my laundry, I can't stand it. But if we had a plural form of the word cling as a noun, it would be clings. And then, of course, cling is also a verb. Okay, so now that we've thoroughly confused the situation, how do we get clarity here? Well, there's actually a very simple way to get clarity here. And the clarity comes from remembering the wider context. And the context, in this case, is always going to be a sentence. In the context of a sentence, how do we match the subject and the verb? Is there one subject? If there's one subject, the verb reflects that there's one subject. Are there several subjects? If there are several subjects, the verb reflects that there are several subjects. And this is in fact something we do all the time instinctively. When we're talking, we don't normally confuse our verbs, or we don't usually confuse that agreement between verbs and nouns unless we're learning a language for the first time, in which case it happens all the time and is very natural. Or we're talking about a kind of particular subject that we may not be as familiar with. So this actually gives us an insight into the study of grammar, the learning of grammar, which is this, that when we hone in on some topic, that topic can start to be confusing when our vision becomes quite narrow on that topic. And of course, we have to have a focus to learn things. But the antidote to the confusion that can come from that is by looking again at the larger picture. And again, in this case, the larger picture is the entire sentence. So let's return to our sentences that we had as our examples. Rain and sleet cling or clings to the branches. And the answer, of course, rain and sleet, two things cling to the branches. And as far as whether we add the S or not, here is now the simple answer. In the context of a sentence, in the present tense, when we're talking about a singular subject, we add the S. And that's just the convention in that context, which is a different context than the context of nouns. In the present tense, when we have a plural subject, Marie's example is logs, then we use a verb that reflects that plural subject. And we can remove the question of adding the S from the realm of nouns and then just focus on it in the context of sentences. So I hope, Rosie, that hasn't made things even more confusing, but I'll give you a chance to unmute, or you can type into the chat box. Either way, has that helped to clarify what you were asking about? Rosie says, thank you. Yes. Oh, I'm thrilled to hear it. So hopefully that's helped to clarify things. As you continue through the course, if or even just through lesson 9, and you have any other, you can say, oh, I get this, but I don't get this other thing. Feel free to write back. Just write to our email, and I'll be happy to answer to further clarify that question. And so in the text box I see here, oh yeah, you're getting that Rosie was getting confused with plural nouns. Thank you. Yes, wonderful. And so I commend you actually, Rosie, for asking this question, because the very fact of you asking the question helps us discover a greater clarity about language. And in fact, I learned something in thinking about your question, which is that that some words, which can be both nouns and verbs, you add an S to those words and it does different things depending on whether we're talking about nouns or verbs, which helped me in my own thinking about grammar and language to remember, oh yes, the key is to take a step back and look at the context. So I'm very grateful, Rosie, for your question.